I'm going to do something new here for my 10,000 subscribers special. I'm going to start doing alternate history book reviews whenever I have free time between my normal alternate history videos. These are going to balance talking about plausibility of the alternate history and the quality of the book itself, but if you want to, you can just skip to the review itself. I'm going to start with the quintessential alternate history book, The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick. Before I start, I just want to say, I haven't seen the TV show, so I can't comment on it. Before we start, I just want to say this review will have no spoilers of the plot, but however, I'll talk quite a bit about the lore, so keep that in mind. The Man in the High Castle is set in a world where FDR is shot early in his presidency, thus the New Deal never happens, and the US stays out of the war longer. When it enters, it can't utilize its entire industrial energies, still being stuck in the Depression, and so can't help its allies, and so the Axis powers win World War II and divide up the world, including America, with the West Coast going to the Japanese, and the East Coast going to the Germans, with a neutral buffer state in the Rockies. This is a rough map of the world in 1962 when the book is set as Dick portrays it. Dick's really vague on details and doesn't have a map or anything, so please don't bitch and moan over minor details, since you have no idea on how it looks either. The Japanese dominate East Asia and the Pacific region, while the Nazis dominate Africa, Western Asia, and Europe, as well as the Atlantic region. Light brown and orange being German client and puppet states on this map. I'm going to go into the plausibility part of this review, so if you want to skip to the actual review, click on this link here. Firstly, this timeline already falls into some bad alternate history tropes I've mentioned in another video on that subject, the link to which is in the description, the tropes being numbers 6 and 1 respectively on the top 10 list. If you don't feel like seeing that video, one of them is that Japan could never have really beat the US in World War II, with the US simply being so much more powerful in industry and manpower. Secondly, that any country could conquer or even invade the continental US in the 20th century, again to the US's industrial advantage over any other country, distance from the rest of the world, and naval power. If you disagree with these claims, see that video first and then comment angrily. Whether or not the New Deal was effective is a very political question, with both sides willing to die over their point of view. The truth is, I don't know enough about this to really take a side, but I don't see why a stronger depression would have made the US's war strength weaker, when there would still be the national will, facilities, money, and men to make weapons. Those weapons would still get made. Having the Axis take over the world without American aid is ridiculous. I can accept Britain starving to death without America in the Battle of the Atlantic, but the Russians were already able to prevent the Germans from seizing Moscow before the US entered the war. 80% of German casualties were on the Eastern Front, and the sheer size of Russia would likely make a German conquest impossible. However, likely without Western aid, the Soviets would be unable to defeat the Germans, with the Eastern Front dissolving into a stalemate. One could also make the case that China is simply too large for the Japanese to conquer, being larger than both the United States and the European Union. Dick also has the Nazis land astronauts on the Moon and Mars in the early 60s. In retrospect, this is ridiculous, but it's forgivable when you realize this book was written in the early 60s, when they thought we'd be colonizing space far sooner than we actually did. Hell, just turn on Star Trek or The Twilight Zone, and you'll feel a sense of joy that we advanced so far with computers and sadness that we lag so far behind in space. So when you understand the time and place this was written in, you can understand how Dick could have thought that if the Nazis had slightly better aeronautical technology, they could have been in space. This logic also applies to the usage of rockets for intercontinental travel that takes place in The Man in the High Castle. Dick also has the Nazis exterminating the native population of Africa, replacing them with Europeans like what happened in North America to the American Indians. This is definitely not what Hitler had in mind. He felt the heat of the tropics were unhealthy for the Aryan master race, and felt they never could be settled by them. He felt the Aryans should lord over the native Africans, not exterminate them. I could totally see something similar to feudalism developing in a Nazi Africa, not extermination. This doesn't even include that this happens in 15 years, which is simply physically impossible for a region 3 times the size of the United States and a population of 200 million. Dick also has the Nazis draining the Mediterranean, replacing it with farmland. This doesn't work on so many different levels. Firstly, after the extermination of the Africans and Eastern European Slavs that Dick portrays, the last thing the Nazis would need is more farmland. Also, this would be unbelievably hard. Since blocking up Gibraltar and letting the Mediterranean go dry would take millions of years to submerge the sea, and pumping it out physically would be impossibly hard, especially for 15 years. Even if some god intervened to allow it to happen, such lands would be uninhabitable salt flats, like those seen in western Utah. Plus, the Mediterranean is probably one of the best things to have ever happened for trade. It connects an enormous region with the ocean and thus trade. For example, getting rid of the Mediterranean would turn fairly coastal Rome into roughly as far removed from the coast as Colorado is from the Pacific. Also, Hitler purges the Catholics and the highly religious. Hitler definitely hated religion's alternate power base, but he felt it was a balancing force that kept the world stable and thus tolerated it, and I don't see this changing in this timeline. Plus, there are simply too many Christians, being 99% of Germany's population, including in Hitler's high command, that this would have been impossible. So in summary, The Man in the High Castle is very inaccurate, but one of the pros of this book is that he makes you believe it. It's probably the author's background in science fiction, but this is one of those books that makes your head tell you that it's completely inaccurate, but your instincts believe it. The world building for this book is fantastic. No mean feat for a book only slightly longer than 200 pages, down to the smallest details, with marijuana being legal in the Japanese Empire, to alternate histories being written about what if the Allies won the war, getting all the details wrong. When it comes to lore and backstory, an issue with this book is its short length, in that it only covers the West Coast and the Rockies, so you don't really get a good picture at what's going on in the rest of the country, let alone Europe or Africa. Hell, the reader doesn't even know if the Confederacy is an independent country, but I understand Dick didn't want to make this some sprawling epic. The book covers multiple interconnected characters connected with each other on some level as I deal with many different issues. If you want a simple, straightforward narrative that starts and ends and doesn't jump away to other subplots, this will greatly confuse you. The writing style itself is very simple, and the length of the book is quite short, making this a fairly quick read. I personally finished it within a few days. It's a real page-turner, and will make you continually read more of it. The book is essentially a thriller, with the plot changing very quickly in a lot of very dramatic ways. The beginning and final 40 pages are the best part, with the drama insanely piling up at the end, forcing you to finish the book. The plot is general, and very clever and well constructed. The author apparently wrote this book by using the ancient Chinese fortune-telling tradition I Ching to see what would happen to the characters, and it really shows dramatic changes happening on the turn of a dime. The characterization is good by the low standards of science fiction or fantasy, but average to bad by the standards of genres that are based on character. It's sort of on the level where you'll remember the characters here by their occupation and their nationality, rather than their personality, if you know what I mean. But in general, assume all the characters will be awful in the books I review in this series, since alternate history tends to be an outgrowth of science fiction, a genre that tends to have terrible characterization, so don't hold it against this book. An issue with this book is the climax. The climax is horribly rushed and should have been twice the length. The best part of the book by far is the climax, and it's so brief, and I don't see why Dick couldn't have extended it. Honestly, this book's short length is an issue, in which it has to balance between the world's building and the actual plot, and this book could have been so much better if Dick simply added another 100 pages or so to work on both. The thing I despise by far the most about this book is the ending. No spoilers, but I could see why Dick thought this ending was smart, but it just comes off as lazy and idiotic. The entire book raises questions which the reader expects the writer to answer, but he never does. I'm sure he thought it was some profound statement about the nature of the human soul that we need to read between the lines to understand, but he never gives us any lines to read between. The ending just makes me want to strangle the book, and ruins the entire work in my perspective. Also, almost none of the subplots are resolved. We don't know how any of the issues end. Dick could have made this work so much better if he elaborated on the ending somewhat, but he never did. The entire work feels incomplete without an ending, and simply adding another 20 pages would have been able to wrap things up. I just feel like Dick only had this book three-quarters done when his agent told him he had to finish in 20 minutes, and he made this ending. So in summary, the pros for this book are excellent world building and a clever and suspenseful plot. The cons being the awful end, and it really should have been longer to expand on the excellent framework. Also keep in mind this is one of the earliest works of alternate history, and brought it into the attention of the mainstream, so keep in mind that all the rest of alternate history afterwards is based on the trailblazing work of this book. My rating system is based on if I like the book, it gets above a 5, and if I disliked it, it gets beneath a 5. I give this book a solid 5. Some parts of this book I really liked, and others I hated, so it balances out right in the middle. But I definitely think you should read it more than its mediocre position in the chart warrants. Its short length makes it not much of a commitment to read, and its pivotal role in the genre means that to understand the genre and as a general introduction, you should read it. What if Altist? Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that review, please comment or subscribe, and please stay tuned for my next video. Thank you.